Hello, Internet. Welcome back to Thrums to Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, those who are interested, about books, movies, music I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. Today we will be talking about Will Self's debut book and his debut short story collection from 1991. This book is called The Quantity Theory of Insanity. I'm going to talk a little bit about Will Self as a figure and my relationship to him initially for a few minutes. Then I'll talk about the stories in this book and I'll give a little summary of my opinion at the end. Now, Will Self, I think, is an interesting guy because he came out in the early 90s. As I say, this was written in 91. I think he'd written some of these stories in the late 80s. And he was almost immediately a kind of household name. When I was a teenager, he was in music magazines, he was on television as part of this vaguely satirical, absurd kind of quiz show or panel show called Shooting Stars with two British comedians. He was also known as having been kicked off the Prime Minister at the time's aeroplane. John Major was the Prime Minister, and Will Self was sent to cover something political, and he was on this aeroplane shooting up heroin in the bathroom. And so he had a little scandal to his name. He was this kind of very intellectual, bookish, literary figure who cultivated a certain kind of bad boy persona at the same time, at a time when this was still possible. I guess he was like the part of the last generation who did this. Right before him, you had Salman Rushdie and Martin Amis. Maybe some Americans have done it later, but in the UK, I guess he was like the last sort of serious novelist who was also a pop cultural figure. And he wrote books that were sort of satirical and a little bit brutal. So he was part of the same period as Irvine Welsh when he was coming out. But Self had more of a kind of verbose style, and he was a little more surreal, and he was a little more hard to place in terms of genre. He got massively hyped reviews around this book, and everything subsequently has kind of divided people. The interesting thing as well about Will Self is, though he is this famous as I'm describing, he must be one of the most famous novelists in the UK of the 90s. No person has ever recommended a Will Self book to me, and most people I know haven't read any of them. So I've now read Dr. Mukti and Other Tales of Woe, Walk into Hollywood, this one, and Cock and Bull, which was his second or third book. It's a weird thing where it's like he has a massive readership and he was always covered in the newspapers, but I don't really know anyone who's ever read him. So I'll be super interested to hear from any Will Self enthusiasts in the comments, or anybody who has read his work, whatever you think of it. And I'm now going to talk a little bit about this particular book. Something that's interesting about this book is that Will Self introduces a lot of stories and characters and concepts that he continued to write about through his career going forward. And the first story in this book, which in my opinion is one of the strongest, is also an example of this. He introduces a concept that when you die, you don't pass on to another life or go into oblivion. You just move to another part of London. So the narrator of this book sees his dead mother one day and discovers that she's moved to another part of North London and goes to visit her. And there's a certain amount of comedy around like the Jewish mother in this story. Will Self's mother was Jewish. And this idea about the dead moving somewhere else in the city and continuing a kind of prosaic existence, he would develop into a full novel called How the Dead Live. This story itself is called The North London Book of the Dead. And the North London Book of the Dead, instead of being like a Tibetan Book of the Dead, is a kind of guidebook to how to be one of these dead people, where they have their own citizens advice bureau. So he kind of satirizes the mundane bureaucracy of everyday life. It might remind you slightly of those scenes in Beetlejuice where people are sitting in waiting rooms to talk to their kind of social worker. The second story is a bit longer. It's called Ward 9. It follows an art therapist who gets a position at a hospital on Ward 9, a huge hospital that kind of towers over the city. And here you begin to see the influence of the Gothic and Gothic horror fiction on Self's writing. This ward is run by a sort of renegade psychiatrist figure who is sort of a combination of like Oliver Sacks and R.D. Laing. He has strange ideas about how to run a ward where he doesn't distinguish clearly between the patients and the therapists. And these are just roles that anybody can take at any given time. So the art therapist, when he comes into this environment, without fully realizing it, is kind of being subjected to a series of tests as to whether he is a therapist or a patient. But I also want to say that Zach Busner, the psychiatrist in this story, it's the first appearance of very many throughout Self's books. And although I haven't read that many of Self's books, I know that he appears in a couple of other ones. The Book of Dave he's in, I think he's in Great Apes, and he's in Dr. Mukti, which I have read. He's a sort of antagonist character often. People have compared him also to Will Self, who is very interested in psychiatry, though Self himself was a patient when he was in his late teens or early 20s, I believe, not only for addiction issues, but for quite serious mental health problems. Okay, so the third story, Understanding the Ur-Bororo, is a kind of satire of anthropology and of the way that Western academics exoticize people from other parts of the world, and especially tribes who have not been exposed to Western influence. And it kind of takes this idea that a tribe like this, who live out in the Amazon or somewhere, or live on some untouched island, that they will have some kind of wisdom or something valuable for us to learn, and this idea that we can go and kind of plunder their wisdom. The whole premise of this story is that this tribe, the Ur-Bororo, the most interesting thing about them is how boring they are. Their entire society is founded on boredom and mediocrity. And the story is written kind of at one remove through a guy who is very interested in somebody who has studied this tribe. My issue with this story is it's kind of just one joke, and I guess if you think that it's written in a way that kind of brings out the comedy and that it's amusing, then it will work for you. But I found it somewhat tedious. And yeah, okay, I guess maybe that's the point, since it's about the tribe being tedious. But I have a low tolerance for things that are boring. Now, the story that follows it, Quantity Theory of Insanity, this is another story that is based around one single concept, and that is the quantity theory of insanity, which essentially is that there's only so much sanity and insanity available in any given society or community, and that it's always distributed more or less the same. So if one group of people or one person gets the sanity, then there will be evenly distributed insanity somewhere else within this community. It's a sort of hydraulic idea of sanity, insanity, or an idea of it as a constant equilibrium, a kind of homeostasis that must always be maintained. It's an interesting concept and it's addressed in interesting ways. It's also, this is one of the more comic stories in my opinion, because it's about a guy who developed this theory. And there are other parts of the story where he is clearly sort of paranoid or slightly psychotic. All of the people that he works with around it are very strange, slightly grotesque figures. So it has, again, this sort of unsettling gothic edge, and it's also very playful, like Ward 9, around what is and what is not sane. This is something I think that Self is always working through in his stories. Trying to kind of undermine our concepts of normality, sanity, hierarchy. So that's a really strong story, but the one that follows it, Monocellular, this is my least favorite. It's a kind of absurd story where the narrator seems to have been conned by some kind of businessman type who has gotten him to invest in something that's not totally clear what it is, whether it might be kind of some quite unsavory dolls shaped like children possibly, but then at the end of it they seem to be maybe something else. And the story is kind of lots of focus on his difficulties with sleeping and his gastric issues, and his thoughts about this guy who maybe has seduced him in some way into investing a lot of money. But it's kind of unclear what's happening around him. It's filtered very much through the mind and the language of a very unusual guy. I guess he's going for this sort of creepy, weird, and disorienting gothic approach. But for me, this one really didn't land. The last story, Waiting, is influenced, I think, both by J.G. Ballard, but also maybe even more by Ian Sinclair, who writes a lot of psychogeography stuff about London and the ring road around London, and generally the effects of the city on the psyche of its inhabitants. I should say that this entire book is a kind of London book, and Self is somebody who grew up in London, so I think as well part of his reception in the British media has to do with the fact that in the 90s the entire British media was basically focused in London, so this is like a hometown book for them. But the story Waiting is about a narrator who has a friend who has become kind of obsessed with the idea that everybody is waiting and that there's some sort of constant waiting. And this reflects a little bit the 90s feeling that the millennium was drawing near, that something was going to happen, that everybody was always waiting for some great event, the millennium bug or the end of the world. And Self kind of weaves this into the London traffic system, couriers, taxi drivers, how these people have a certain relationship to space and time and are always trying to get somewhere quicker. The friend's relationship to waiting is sort of escalating through the story, and he's become friends with some Welsh guy called Carlos, who has his own sort of cult built around this. And I like this story a lot. I thought that the final sentence was kind of a letdown because Welsh put a punchline in. And again, I feel like his aspirations as a humorist are not as well executed as his sort of weird, speculative, gothic, surreal aspects within the work. Still, I liked it a lot. So, my general feeling about this book is that there were two stories that were significantly weaker and that the good stories were interesting. Something that's just fascinating about reading Will Self is that he's writing really conceptual, strange, slightly disturbing, disorienting, gothic stories that are not recognizably in the horror genre. They're not using horror tropes, but they are kind of unsettling and horrifying. They're not science fiction, but they are speculative. They're not really comedy, but they are written with a comic register. So he's doing something really interesting. I do kind of understand how this book took off, but at the same time, I just think it's fascinating to look back now at the 90s and see that stuff like this was within mainstream culture. There was nothing this weird or disorienting or experimental really making it into mainstream life today. Like somebody coming out writing something equivalent now, there is no way that they would be like a household name that families with children would be seeing this writer turning up on the TV screen or equivalent. I'm going to leave it there for now, but I would love to hear your opinions of this book, of Will Self, or anything else that this video made you think about. Thanks for now. See you soon.